In today's episode, we go behind the scenes to discover the creative process behind some of the most iconic albums of the 1980s. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. Folks, without a doubt, this episode was an absolute blast, and I was pleased to have our guest today, co-writer and producer Cody Greenwood, and co-writer director Gracie Otto. And look, I hope you spread the word about this film, Under the Volcano, because it just was released today. So anybody that has access to the internet can now see the film. And I think it's a special film. So I hope it really does make the rounds because it absolutely deserves to be seen. You know, Cody and Gracie were very forthcoming with their time, and really we got into the nitty gritty of all the behind the scenes stuff that they covered, but adding a little more depth to it and then getting into some of the stories that didn't make it into the film. And I really love this film. It's fascinating. And as you'll hear me say, when the police broke up, it was just devastating to me. And seeing the breakup unfold in the recording sessions kind of and the alienation that the members were getting with each other is definitely a highlight of this film. And I love it so much. So look, Cody and Gracie were very generous with their time and had a lot of things to input about their own creative process. So I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And folks, you know, we just recently published our Black Widow issue, our summer issue. And, you know, we've continued adding stuff to it, even though we're already published. So there is a lot to explore. And I hope you check out the table of contents over at backstory.net. And also, you know, if you've never read us before, I hope you check out the free issue, which you could also read at backstory.net or via our iPad app. And, you know, if you like what you see and you want to support independent film journalism, you could become a subscriber. And if you do, I hope you use code SAVE5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription of Backstory Magazine. You could use that at our website, but your login credentials will still work on an iPad. So it's a way to subscribe to us without paying an extra 30% to Apple, which we really love and appreciate whenever you could do. But there's a lot to explore at Backstory, and it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners in iTunes and Spotify, and of course my YouTube watchers at the Backstory Magazine YouTube page watching all these Zoomcast Q&As be able to support my passion project. So thanks for considering. And of course, if you want to attend one of these virtual screenings, you could always sign up over at our website, backstory.net/events. And that will put you on our email list. And then you'll get notifications when we're doing virtual screenings and hopefully getting back to in-person screenings. You'll get an email from time to time about what the magazine and podcast are up to as well. And it's totally free. So just backstory.net/events. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with co-writer and producer Cody Greenwood and co-writer director Gracie Otto about their latest film, Under the Volcano. Gracie, Cody, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming on to the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank
Halfway
you.
around the world, what respective cities are you all in?
I'm in Sydney, so it's Saturday morning. Cody's in Perth.
I'm in
Nice.
Western Australia. I had to go through 4 states to get back. It's like playing border Tetris in Australia at the moment to try to move around.
Right, because some lockdowns are starting, right?
Everywhere but where Cody is.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to an outdoor dinner tonight. I'm fully vaccinated and I'm going to be on a patio somewhere. And I know I'm
Love
probably
it.
not going to be able to do that for much longer if people don't calm down. But hey, this is all about a virtual screening that people are watching from the convenience of their own home. So let's get into it. So, you know, I always love to give our podcast listeners just a sense of who you are and where you come from. Gracie, your father is a legendary actor in Australia. So you kind of have an entertainment background, but that doesn't mean that all children of entertainers go into the entertainment industry. What do you think led you on your path to getting behind the camera, differing from your father rather than being in front of it?
I was always interested. I mean, I played a lot. I played soccer for Australia when I was in school. My mum side of the family, very sporty. But I would go, you know, I grew up in the theatre. My mum had a theatre company, Belvoir Street, she worked at. And Dad was obviously doing a lot of plays. My older sister, Miranda, was acting, and I would make little short films at high school, and I made a short film called Kill Blondes for my end of year school thing, and decided to go to film school. And I kind of always enjoyed, I don't know, telling people what to do as opposed to them telling me what to do. But I did dabble in acting. I just don't think I was that good, but I don't mind it.
Where did you go to film school?
I went to Sydney Film School in like 2000, when I was 17, like 2004 or 5 or something. Years ago.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing to bring up for a second, and we'll get to you in a second, Cody, but like some people have different versions of what they do or don't like from film school. Was it a positive experience for you? Did you find it collaborative, or did you not? What was your highlight of your film school experience?
I loved it because I didn't go to university because you couldn't go on exchange for like 3 years to a film school. And this was a 1.5-year course where basically you got to pitch as a director on, you didn't go for directing or editing, you kind of went for everything. So you would do like 4 films in the first half of the year, but one of them you had like a major role. So you'd be like the director, editor, production designer, and then you'd have a minor role like editor assistant or something like that. So that was really good because you got to learn about all the different departments. I obviously went pretty hard on a pitch on the first one to get director because I was like, I'm here to direct. And then we did, you know, documentary, and we would work in teams of 4. And I think I was an editor on a documentary about Italian Vespers coming to Australia. But it never really, I guess the documentary teachers who were great, they did a lot of kind of social docs, and that wasn't really the style of documentary I was ever interested in. And then I was in Cannes Film Festival when I was like 21 and met this guy, Michael White. And I think, you know, I just thought I'd be able to get a feature up, but it takes like 10 years. Whereas a documentary, I always say like documentary is like jumping out of a plane. You've got access, you've got a camera, you can get going, then you figure out how to fund it. Whereas a feature film, you kind of, you know, spend 10 years in development trying to get it up. So with him, you know, he was like, go interview Yoko Ono, go interview Kate Moss, all these people. And, you know, I had the access to do that. So I spent, you know, 3 years going around the world doing that. And I just loved the process of it, you know, because I didn't go to university. And it was kind of like a study into British theatre and culture in the 60s and 70s. And that's how I kind of really got, into documentary.
Well, and that led to your first documentary film, The Last Impresario.
Yeah. And that was amazing. It was just, I mean, I met so many incredible people through Michael, but his lifestyle and the way he lived life and, you know, the kind of doors he opened for me, you know, he passed away after the film, but it was an incredible, like personal kind of film to make on someone. And it was just so nice to spend, such quality time at the end of his life. And and I guess because he'd started the theatre and my mum had, and my dad, and I was just fascinated with that era.
That's awesome. And then we're gonna get to Cody in one more second, but you also you also transitioned into television, which is a totally different type of directing. You did Pipo, and then you did The Other Guy. What were your kind of lessons, trial by fire of your TV experience coming from short films and documentary past?
I love TV because it's so fast, and so you know you get a good chance to take on a show that you know to spend 5 years of your life on. I love, you know, in Australia we shoot like 8 to 10 pages a day, so it's such a, you know, and then you kind of edit in like 4 days and get kind of a rough cut of the episode. So it's for me, you know, Cody and I are very similar in that way. We like speed and we're very fast, and so I think TV for me is super fun. So I like doing all, you know, I'm in post on my first feature film at the moment, and that's a completely different process as well because it's, you know, you have kind of the script to begin with, whereas doco, you know, I think we're in the edit for like 20 weeks or something. It was a really long edit process, and so I just like doing it all. And I think in Australia you can get easily pigeonholed into just one category. So I just thought I'd just try everything.
That's a smart tactic to move around. You leave your options open.
Yeah.
So that definitely makes sense. Cody, tell us about your path. Like what made you choose entertainment? I know you also started with some short films.
Yeah, I mean, in a similar way to Gracie, I grew up with parents in the entertainment industry. My mum studied documentary making at UCLA. So I studied media all throughout high school. I was completely obsessed. And then I went straight into media. I did university. So I did a bachelor here in Western Australia. And then I had the same idea as Gracie. I wanted to go on an exchange program. And I ended up going to Oxford Brookes in Oxford in the UK and doing the film course over there. And then I came back from
wait,
Oxford.
before you move on, sorry to interrupt. What was, just same question that I asked a second ago, what was the highlight of your film school experience? Did it click something for you, or could you have gotten away without going to film school?
I think that part of film school I could have got away without going to, but then I went from Oxford Brookes over to UCLA, and I did it was just started with a certificate of independent producing, and I loved it. And I think that for me was really when it clicked, my love of producing, because I'd kind of been floating around in different roles, knew that I loved film, wasn't sure exactly what aspect it was. And then when I went to UCLA, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I'm meant to be doing. So I probably could have skipped everything prior to that and just gone to UCLA and done the certificates. But anyway, you live and you learn, don't you?
Well, there you go. And then your kind of first big official feature documentary was Angela's Rules, which also is in the music realm of documentaries. So what was your biggest lesson of doing that, even though you had done shorts before that and you had produced before that?
Mm. Yeah, I had a really incredible introduction into the film industry because the first documentaries that I ever worked on were for our national Indigenous broadcaster here in Australia called NITV. And there was a set of 15 documentaries, one being Angela's Rules, that was directed by emerging Indigenous filmmakers about everyday Indigenous Australians in the face of adversity. So they were the most incredible stories. Angela's Rules is an amazing story. There was a spin-off called Family Rules here in Australia, but it's essentially about a family of 9 Indigenous women who were raised by a single mum. And they're like the Kardashians. They are the most hilarious family, and they're really wonderful, intelligent women. But Angela, the oldest, is a singer. And so it was sort of about her journey being a singer and also what the family has sort of gone through. But yeah, for that to be my introduction into the film world, it's still one of the biggest highlights of my career, and it's sort of where I started. So I feel really fortunate.
That's cool. And it prepared you for today's film, which we're going to get into right now. Tell us how the two of you kind of coalesced and what your initial idea was when you realized that there was a documentary potential for Under the Volcano. Not to be confused with the John Huston film of the 70s, by the way, which I kind of love as a very depressing movie, but yours is completely different.
Very different. Yeah, it has sort of personal origins, this story for me. My mum was a artist, and she was living in Montserrat in the 70s. She had heard about this island in the Caribbean where the harbour was always going to be too shallow for cruise ships, and planes couldn't land because it was too mountainous and volcanic. And she decided to go down there in the 70s and start a career as an artist, after being a documentary filmmaker. And she was down there in the late 70s, and a guy called George Martin, who happened to produce the Beatles, was also down there at the same time. And they met, and he said, oh, I'm building a recording studio here. And so she was there during the first few years of the studio, became really good friends with all of the musicians, and then would sell her artwork to them to make a living. So Gracie and I, when we were interviewing people, her artwork was all throughout their house, which was really cool.
That's
But
awesome.
I would always go down to Montserrat as a kid. My mum would hold art exhibitions in Antigua, which is the neighboring island to Montserrat. And I was there sort of pre-volcano and post-volcano, and searching through all the relics of my dad under the volcano to find all sorts of cool stuff. So for me, I'd always known about the studio. I'd never been there as a kid, but I would I knew it was there, and I knew the stories. And one day there was a guy in Perth, Western Australia, where I was living at the time, who was just talking about the studio. He was one of the managing directors. And I said to him, has anybody ever made a film about this? And he was like, well, there's been teams that have tried, but if you want to give it a go, then be my guest. And that kind of started the whole process, and was about a 2-year research period before I brought Gracie on board.
Really, 2 years. Tell us about that research period and how you started forming, an idea of what the structure could be. Because obviously you're the producer, but you're also the co-writer, and Gracie's also the co-writer and the director. So, people forget that documentaries are written, and you do need to have a structure. And I really like the structure that you found.
Totally.
So tell us about your research period.
Yeah. It was only 10 years. Air Montserrat was around from 79 to 89, but there was a lot of music that came down. That studio had so many different artists every year. So the first part of the research period was really about, what was all the music that was recorded there. But I knew straight off the bat that we didn't want this to be a recording studio doc in the way of Muscle Shoals or Sound City, which I think are great documentaries, but I was really wary of presenting album after album after album. And I actually thought that the stories of what the bands had been down there, the bands that have been down there, their personal stories were what was really interesting, the relationships in the band. So the research was very much focused on, well, who are our key artists, and which was, the Stones, Dire Straits, Paul McCartney, Elton John, the Police, and what happened to them down there and what happened to their relationships. And so that was really what I was focusing on from a research point of view. And I didn't have a director attached. I reached out to Sting and said, I really love to do an interview. And bless him, he said, of course, no problem. Come to New York in 2 weeks' time. And Crystal Moselle, who directed The Wolfpack and Skate Kitchen, who's incredible. I got in touch with her and I said, I don't have a director attached. It's going to be an Australian film, but would you segment direct the Sting interview? And she was like, of course, like no problem. So he came on board, and then once Sting was there, he really shaped the narrative of the film as well, because I realized that the volcano had a real presence for him, and that this place was somewhere that really affected him personally. So I think once I had his interview in the can, the research sort of really developed from there.
That's amazing. I mean, we're going to definitely get into what they discussed in the interviews a bit later. Well, so then tell me how Gracie came on.
So I knew I needed an Australian director. The film was financed out of Australia, and there's certain targets that we have to hit when we're doing that kind of financing. And I had been I'd really admired Gracie's work. I'd seen what she'd done with The Last Impresario. I knew that she was somebody who could work with celebrity, because some of these guys are getting a little bit grumpy in their time. And then the other thing was, I knew that this was going to be a male-dominated story. There wasn't hardly any women who'd recorded at the studio. So I wanted a female director. I wanted somebody who could sort of bring a female lens to this story. And Gracie was my first choice. And I just got so lucky that she turned around and said yes.
Actually, but Gracie, yes. before you say that, one of the artists that I know was on the list that I think recorded there was Diana Ross. Was there ever like a way that you were considering including more of her in the documentary? Because she's just kind of mentioned in passing.
I don't think that there's so many artists with the Air Studios history that they say in research recorded there, but they didn't. One being Michael Jackson. Diana Ross gets mentioned, but she didn't either. I think with Air Studios, they sometimes cross them. There was Annie Lennox was down there, who would have been amazing. She's in the film and footage, and Sheena Easton, but we couldn't get either of them. So
and wasn't Sushi and the Banshees in there as well in footage?
Yes.
Oh, that was at Air London.
No, yeah. Air London, yeah.
Air London. Yeah. Okay, got it. That's I think the crossover. Well, so Gracie, when you heard about this and you're coming on for a documentary, what was some of your initial takes on it and how to get through it?
Well, at first it was pretty overwhelming. Like Cody's research document was this 70-page kind of Bible that had every band that had been there, every story. So it was hard at first, because I'd try to find something to kind of go, oh, I found this, and Cody'd be like, yeah, that was in 1984, or and I think when we came together to work on it, it was like I always like to tackle things like kind of doing a treatment that we say, okay, what are the 10 major storylines that we think happened over this time, and then starting to kind of, just break it down and say, all right, so we've got, these 5 bands we think are great. And well, how do we tell this? We need to interview these people. It'd be great to try find archive from this area. These would be the kind of songs at that time that they might talk about, or, we'd like to license. So it's a lot of kind of like funneling down to, start somewhere. And then I guess when we started some interviews, like, Jerry Beckley or Mildura were incredible, because they really had a good, landscape of like either the place or like George Martin, or could tell, like Ray Cooper was another voice in the film that was able to kind of tell a lot about something that isn't just about the bands, like an overall picture. So they kind of helped shape that kind of narrative. And then it was like working out, we had the bands that we wanted, and it kind of by a fluke it fitted chronologically into that decade, which is really lucky. So we didn't really have to play around with too much jumping between times. And then, yeah, it was really, I guess some of the difficulties were in the edit. How do we,
We'll get to the editing. We'll get to the editing a little later. I don't want to skip too far ahead. But I guess the question would be, one of the things that the documentary captured really well, as you said, it's not just like a track listing of who came through there and what they recorded. You covered the creation of music, kind of like live and unfolding before you in a studio, which was a very expensive process back then because studios were so expensive. So when the pressure was immense when you went into a studio to catch that lightning in a bottle. And you did a great job of covering the creative process. I'm curious, what are some of the music documentaries that influenced you both, that kind of gave you that eye towards it as you approached your own documentary?
I mean, I feel like we watched a lot of documentaries, from the one about in the canyons, Muscle Shoals, Sound City, and then, yeah, we had obvious things that we kind of thought we wanted to do differently. There was one iteration where it was like, were we going to tell the story of the two guys that built the studio? But that kind of leaned a bit too into like Muscle Shoals territory. But yeah, I guess it was like we had so many parts of the film. Like we obviously had Sir George Martin, we had the island itself and the people who lived on the island, we had the studio, we had all the big bands, we had the hurricane, we had the volcano. So it was kind of like how to squeeze that into an hour and a half.
And you did a great job. Cody, was there any documentaries that you were like favorite of that kind of influenced you?
Well, I really love some music docos that are so different from Under the Volcano, but I really loved Exile on Main Street. I think that was one called The Stones one in the south of France. Was that one? Because I just loved the music docs and Don't Look Back, Bob Dylan, where you just kind of immersed into the world more in an observational capacity, which is very different from Under the Volcano. But I think what I loved about those was the intimacy of those music documentaries and feeling like you really got a chance to know the artists. And I think that's probably why when we were making Under the Volcano, we really lent on the personal story aspects of these musicians, because I struggle with the music documentaries when I don't get a chance to connect to the people. Like the music's great, but I want to know about the people and I want to understand their story. So those were references for me.
That makes sense. Obviously, The Filth and the Fury is one of my favorite music docs about the Sex Pistols. And what's interesting there is, the usage of, yes, modern interviews, but also archival footage going back and forth with them telling us what they were thinking and then seeing them back in the day. And I thought that you had transitions like that all over the place in Under the Volcano that really told the story behind some of these really iconic songs, coming at it from a different angle in places in which sometimes you were only using archival footage, but then you were using modern footage of the technicians in the studio telling the stories that some of the artists might never have told themselves, which I thought was really cool. But for the start of this, you can't get away with anything without having the cooperation of the Martin estate. So what was it like to kind of get in there, pitch this to them and work with them, and then to start going through their archives to see what you could springboard off of for the documentary?
Yeah, when I initially spoke to the guy and I said to him, the managing director of AIR, can I do this documentary? And he said, go for it, good luck. His advice to me was write a letter to Judy Martin. So George Martin had passed away at that time, and Judy loves receiving letters. So I wrote her from Australia a handwritten note, saying this is, you would have met my mum back in the day. And my mum at that time used to still, and she still does, she receives Christmas cards from Judy. So, they were still in touch. And she said, yeah, we're open to this, but, we'd love to sit down. And so what I then did was, on a whim, I took a flight over to the UK and I sat down with the manager of Sir George Martin's estate and sort of just had a real heart to heart with him. And I was so nervous. I was sweating. My face was bright because I just, just come over from Australia all the way there to meet with him. And he was like, no, we think that what you're doing is really great. I do think there was initially hesitation because there was a lot of stuff that happened at Montserrat that is not covered in the film, that is quite like salacious and tabloidy. And, it was never our intention to go there. That wasn't the film we were trying to make. But I can imagine that if somebody came to the Martin estate and said, we want to do a film about Montserrat, they would have been like, oh, are they going to sort of go into, some of the stuff that went on down there? So that was the initial meeting, and then it was just a long process of building trust and keeping in communication with them. And then when we did the interviews with Giles Martin, who's Sir George's son, and Judy at their house in the UK, I think that was a real moment where they were like, okay, we've met Gracie now too, and we really trust this team. But yeah, it's a long trust building process. And I think for somebody as prolific as Sir George Martin, you know, those relationships are just so important to uphold.
So was there a period where you got to go into their archive? Because a lot of footage looks like it was filmed in their studio and clearly would be a part of their archive. So you had to discover it at some point.
Yeah, well, I actually, from the initial, as soon as Judy Martin said yes to doing the documentary, the guys who ran Air Studios kind of like gave me a suitcase filled with archive and were like, take this back to Australia. And I had it in Australia. I actually brought it over to Sydney in a suitcase to show Gracie at one stage. I was like, I've got all this stuff. And then Judy Martin, bless her, when we were interviewing her, she just was giving us her photo albums off her shelf. She was like, take this and take this. And I was always so scared that I was going to lose those precious photographs, and they're incredible and really intimate. So we were very lucky that it was a combination of Air Studios and Sir George's family who just gave us, you know, it was a gold mine.
Just for like a last question before we're kind of couple questions before we get into the deeper part of the spoiler section, you know, when you're putting together a documentary, as you both said, you're right. There's a part of it, unlike feature film, where you just grab whatever camera you have access to, you start shooting, you start seeing anything you have, so you could start laying out a template and going from there. How did you budget it early on? Or was it just self-funded the entire time? And that was the intent, as a lot of documentaries are?
This was my first feature documentary, and I remember pitching it at a conference in Australia, the International Documentary Conference, and I got up on a stage because I was trying to get people to come on board, and I said, this film is going to cost X, and I had people pulling me aside and saying, you're never going to get that much money for this film. And I was like, but I have to, because of the music. I don't think you understand what I'm dealing with. And then it was really, I knew what a documentary cost. I did not know what some of the biggest tracks of the 1980s were going to cost, or
Right.
how much Paul McCartney was going to charge for his home video footage. And he was an absolute angel in that regard. But I got a music supervisor to help me with those costings. And the way I did it at that point was I just said, you know, what were the biggest tracks that came out of Montserrat? Let's pick 30 of them, and I'll cost it out that way. And, you know, the big ones like Every Breath You Take will have for X long. And I just did this weird estimate, which ended up actually working. But when Gracie came on board, when we started making the film, there was a decision in the edit process of, well, every time there's a big band, let's have a hit song. Let's have, you know, Your Song by Elton John or Roxanne by the Police. And that stuff wasn't budgeted for. So that's always really fun as a producer, to try and figure out how you pay for expensive music that's not even recorded at Montserrat.
Well, so to that effect, like, are you able to say what the budget was of the documentary, all said and done?
I don't know.
No.
I mean,
Okay.
you say no. You say it's north of, yeah. It's expensive. Let's put it that way.
It's expensive enough to be like, you know, Cody and I always joke saying, I mean, why didn't we just make a documentary on the Police? We had all their home videos, we had all the band members.
Right.
They recorded 2 albums down there. It would have been so much easier. But, you know, I always say to Cody, like, no other documentary will ever be this hard, because when you're trying to go, you know, the music supervisor's trying to talk to the Rolling Stones team at the same time, Paul McCartney and everybody, it's like, it's overwhelming, the amount of big names in the film in that regard, and the music.
I mean, just the music, the needle drops you have from all these huge bands in the 80s. I can't imagine what your budget was, because I know, you know, filmmakers that come in the podcast to talk about trying to get these drops in a feature. It's like nearly impossible.
I mean, it was
It
still,
took me a
I
long
guess,
time.
you know, some of the expensive stuff was really the travel. Like Cody and I been in Australia, and, you know, we did everything compared to my last documentary when I shot nearly every interview myself and did all the sound. This one was like a 2-camera setup. So it was like a bigger deal in that way, but it was still a very small team that made the film in the end.
What did you shoot on? What cameras?
We shot on the Alexa, 2 Alexas. We had,
Okay.
Yeah.
And that would be my other question. How long was production per se? Because a lot of people don't realize that in documentaries, there's a lot of start and stop, in which you'll do a round of interviews it'll lead you to different places. You'll want to do a new round of interviews.
We
How
shot
long
like
was
probably
your-
3/4 of the film in the first 10 weeks, but we went pretty hard. We went straight to London, shot 2-3 interviews a day. And then we went down to Montserrat for about, I don't know, 8 or 9 days, shot down there. Then we came back to kind of maybe like a 10-week edit and then started to go, okay, we need Nick Rhodes, we need Martin Offler. There's a few people that with schedules and every band being on tour at that time, good old 2019. So, and then it was, Elton's band were here in the January of 2020, just before COVID. Jerry Beckley then happened to live in Sydney as well. And we, that stage felt like we needed more, history in the film about George Martin and an explanation of that. So he was quite targeted to those kind of questions. But I guess we started filming in the July of 2019. And I mean, we were picture locked by April 2020. I mean, we're pretty speedy.
Oh, wow.
We were like
Okay.
an amazing race.
That's great. Well, so, last non-spoiler question, how much footage were you dealing with in the archival side versus how much footage were you dealing with on the interviews that you shot and the nature footage from the island as well?
Well,
How many
every
hours?
interview was I like to think a good interview is about 45 minutes to an hour. So most of the people who, most of the interviews would be around that stage. Some of them, Verdine from Earth, Wind and Fire, he was only 20 minutes, but he just gave us some gold bits. And then there are some people who kind of sometimes embellish that and go for like 2 hours and you go, well, it's not all going to make it in. But a lot of interviews, so I guess you add that up, I don't know, by 35, 40 interviews and then stuff that was shot down on the island. I mean, our editor, Karen Johnson, would probably know a better answer to that, but there was a lot. And then it's also the archive of going through, we worked with Lisa Savage, archive producer, and obviously Cody had so much archive already and her mum, and, there was stuff we found on the internet, but sometimes
how many hours do you think was the archival?
A lot. Like we had crazy spreadsheets of, sometimes you'd sit and just watch like 30 1-hour interviews from MTV when like Roger Glover came on just to see if they talked about Montserrat. It's like that Lou Reed clip when it was like, when he's like, I went down to Montserrat, like trying to find little things like that because it wasn't, something that people always talked about in interviews. So you would kind of just, you could snowball down into a deep dive on something and get to the
hundreds of hours. At
Wow.
least hundreds, yeah.
That's wild. Well, so okay, we're getting into the spoilers section now. So, for anyone, this was a virtual screening, obviously, and you all just saw the movie. But for anyone listening to the podcast a few days later, if you have not yet seen the movie, this would be the time to press pause, go watch Under the Volcano, come back because we're going to get into all the different details of the movie, and of course, tell your friends to watch it as well. But so here we go. We're in the spoilers. One of the things that you did, as I was alluding to before, that was so impressive was sometimes artists don't have the self-awareness and the distance from themselves to talk about just some of the things that happen behind the scenes because they honestly forget about it too. And you had the upstairs downstairs version of Air Studios in which you interviewed the original staff, the cooks, the drivers, the people that worked there on the soundboards as well. And early on, when you're doing the Earth, Wind and Fire talk, we learned that the song Let Me Talk was really inspired by just one of the drivers who would get frustrated when everyone was talking. And he had this piece of dialogue. He would just say, let me talk. And like that inspired a whole song, which really shows how the staff and the whole atmosphere of Air was influencing the music there. So tell us about interviewing the people on the island that work there and around there, because it could have actually not borne as much fruit as it did for the movie, but you got really lucky because they had great memories and they had very intricate, specific stories to share.
Yeah, early on, I said to Gracie, as soon as Gracie came on board, we've got to interview the people of Montserrat. And I think with the people of Montserrat, they're the most amazing people in the whole world. And I knew that they were going to be the heart of the film. And the first day we did the first interview with Desmond, the bartender, and X, and Gracie met them up, and then she was like, oh, okay, I get this now. I understand why they're so important to the film. And I'd grown up with Danny, the windsurfer who taught Sting how to windsurf, and I knew most of those people, Rose, the radio host. But they really did have an impact on the artists. Every time we would interview somebody, they would say, how's George the chef? Like Jimmy Buffett emailed me the other day and he said, can you pass me on George's details so I can go see him in Boston? Like, there's this great story that didn't make it into the film, but Keith Richards was in New York City and he bumped into Desmond, the bartender, who was on holiday, and George, the chef, in the street. And he said, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're just having a holiday in New York." And he said, "Well, come out to Connecticut and let's hang out." And so everybody was so close to the staff. And if you look at some of the albums, like the Brothers in Arms album, they're credited on there. I think most of the albums down there, they've got something on the back about the staff. They would do backing vocals in the Police and in Elton John's albums. So there were really strong relationships that were formed, and that was really evident. I mean, the first question I ever asked Sting in the interview, he spoke for about 30 minutes about Danny teaching him how to windsurf and some of the stuff that had happened down there. But yeah, I think that they are, like I said, the real heart of the film. And I think we're so fortunate that we were able to access them. With the chef, Gracie and I were trying to get him for months. We found that someone gave us a phone number of where he lived, and we'd call it every couple of days. And then one day we just got lucky and he picked up. And so we flew him out to LA and he spent 4 days with us.
And he was really he was so humble and kind and like gentle and soft. And because we just heard everyone was like, "Whoa, where's the chef?" Like everyone had this, like, we just thought, "Oh, we're going to meet this guy and he's going to be like full on." And he was just so lovely that, we were like, this is George, right? He's like, I don't know if he's changed or he's different, but he was just so kind. And it was so nice it was so exciting. It was like almost like for me, like meeting a celebrity, because I'd heard so much about him. And we got to spend 4 days with him in LA, which was great.
Well, Grace, you also did a great job of capturing the nature of the island, big drone shots flying over, showing the volcano, but the island itself, which plays really a big part of the natural devastation that happened with Hurricane Hugo and then the volcano erupting. What were some of your goals for how you were going to capture that? Because you did it wonderfully.
Well, there was a guy down there who has like a little museum that Cody went to, and he actually had all that footage when the volcano was erupting that, he was shooting down there at the time. I mean, when we first went down there, I was actually a bit scared because when I guess Cody and her mum came down with us on the trip to Montserrat. And when you first arrived at night, we took the ferry because Tony Omi told us this crazy story about one of the plane trips. And I was like, we've got so much equipment, like we're going to take the ferry, but it was this scary kind of 3-hour ferry at night. And we got there and you saw all the cliffs, and then waking up in the first morning, hearing all these sounds of the island that I'd never heard before was amazing. And then going down and seeing all the colourful homes, and it was so lush. And then we went to see where the volcano was, and it was just like devastating. And it was kind of like, this kind of other side of the island and world. And I was hoping that Cody would say, "Oh, look, it's too dangerous," because the police were like, "Hey, you've got to park your car and face it that way in case the volcano erupts, and you'll be able to drive out." And you can hear it, so you have that moment when you're like, I mean, this is kind of dangerous, but
that's wild. You could still hear it. That's totally wild.
Yeah, definitely. Like the presence of it is definitely there. And I think, we had we did some drone shots because we could only walk in so far. We found some incredible places that had kind of, been left untouched since it happened. But definitely was quite an eerie feeling. And it was just interesting driving in there that it was all lush and green, and then it's just the next house is just gone. And to see such a small island, what Mother Nature can do.
I mean, the archival footage was great, but the new nature stuff that you guys shot was awesome as well. When you were getting into the interviews, I was surprised there actually wasn't a little more with Paul McCartney, given the connection to Martin. Were there ever plans?
Paul McCartney was like, I think he was on tour at the time. He was the first person we went to after Sting, because I was, I said to Cody, it's like playing a deck of cards. Like, let's go for the aces, because if you get the ace, you get all the cards. But he watched the film and he really loved it, and he was super kind about giving us his home video footage and everything. But there was like, I think because there's just so many stories we had to go into in the film, and it was like, I mean, I love that section because Cody can speak more about that Stevie Wonder recording, but that was such a massive FOMO of wanting to be there that night when they were recording.
Well, you tell us about that, because they were there together and they did Ebony and Ivory, but you also have this story about Stevie Wonder playing a bar till 4 a.m. And then in the archive, you guys have a recording of him at this bar at 4 a.m, which I was really impressed you were able to find in that archive. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, I was the early days of researching Under the Volcano. I was sitting around having a couple of whiskeys with my dad one night, and at his house, and he was like, "I've got a recording in the attic of Stevie Wonder from Montserrat. I'm pretty sure on a cassette tape." And I was like, "What?" And he went into his attic and he pulled out this cassette tape, and we didn't have a cassette player to play it off in the house anymore. But I went and got this tape digitized, and sure enough, it's an hour-long recording of Stevie Wonder at this tiny bar in Montserrat called the Agouti. There's a photo of him in the film on stage. You can actually see a guy holding a recorder up to the stage. So anyway, so we got this incredible digitized recording, and it's, he's singing all of his hit songs like Superstition, and then he goes off and riffs, and he's riffing about the people, the studio, Paul McCartney, all this stuff. It's incredible. But when it's never that simple with music licensing. It's never a case of, we'll just stick this on the film. We had to get, Stevie Wonder's permission to have that recording. And apparently this is something that Stevie does a lot. He just goes off and riffs. And so his team were like, yeah, that's fine. We'll give you permission to use this. And then my music supervisor was like, hey, hang on a minute. I think he's starting on another song, this song called Stormy Monday. And then he's moving into his riff about Montserrat. So we also had to license that song. So he's, he's a musical genius, but I think that those riffs must be, I'm sure they've been a headache for many other producers before. But it's such a piece of gold. And I just can't believe that my dad had it in his attic.
That's crazy that came from your dad's attic. See, I thought you were going to tell me a story about how it came from the Air archives or something like that. That's totally wild. Again, going back to the upstairs, downstairs, and the technicians, that they provided such great insight. My favorite story really for that was the technician who talked about the day when Elton John was a little angry and decided the album wasn't going right, and he wanted to throw all the tapes in the pool. And the technician had the wherewithal to give him a stack of blank tapes, which he then took outside and angrily threw in the pool. And if he wasn't on point like that, they could have lost days of recording. Some of those songs might have been lost forever, maybe. And I thought that was fascinating. What were some other stories like that maybe didn't make it into the movie, that came from the wild things that the technicians went through in dealing with these very powerful egos and personalities?
I don't think what was others was things.
There was one that Malcolm told us, Gracie. I'm just trying to remember what it was, because there was a lot of times where we there was a John Lennon story. Well, yeah. Well, we just still don't know if it's quite true. That's the thing is everybody's got their memories of that time, and it's really hard with films sometimes to know, especially films. This was made, Montserrat was in the 80s. What was true, but there was a conversation that John Lennon was actually meant to come down to Montserrat and record. I'm so resistant to saying that because I feel like Beatles fans are going to be like, whoa. But there was a conversation about that.
There was a few people that said, it's always hard when it's like, especially going, when you hear stories like Danny saying, Walk of Life, that was written about me. And then one of our last interviews is Mark Knopfler. And it's like, how do we ask him this question? Because what if he says that's not fucking true at all? And then, we've got that in the film, and that's, and then he acknowledges that that is true. And it's like, oh, thank God. So there's moments like that when you're interviewing, when you're like, Elton's obviously seen the film. There's the story about the guy standing up saying, I'm still standing. So once you get the ticket of approval from the people, like the artists themselves with that, it's great because you kind of want to be able to back those stories up, like with anything you're researching.
So in the movie, obviously you have this great way of documenting the creative process, but of course you also show the dark side as well. And I love in the movie where you show Duran Duran coming down and being too young for this experience, and kind of a little outside of their zone, and leaving. And Lou Reed in an archival interview saying that he prefers the noise of the city, which actually makes sense for his music. So tell us about that section, because I thought it was really important to show that Air Studios wasn't for everybody.
Yeah, it was interesting because we always want to get a quite, 360 of the place, and also not just, not be a puff piece love story to the place, but also I think what's great about Nick Rose's interview is that, you know, when we approached him about doing an interview, he was quite happy to talk about how it just wasn't for him. And I remember him sitting in an interview with his like porcelain skin, that beautiful skin, thinking, you know, this guy will, you know, and I think it was our post supervisor had said, oh, when you talk to him, ask him about if he thinks creativity, you know, is better, because our friend's like someone who likes to be in the dark and work at night. It's like that question actually ended up nailing the whole experience for them. Yeah, so I think, you know, they were really young. And when we had these great photos from a guy, Tom Sheenan, that our archive producer found that, and for me, those photos are incredible because they'd never been seen before, but they also, you know, were away from their kind of the hair and makeup and the outfits and all of that, and seeing, you know, Duran Duran on the island like that was really cool.
To add to that as well, this was a film that we edited during COVID. And what we were finding during the edit process is Gracie and I work, you know, the same. We're like crazy people on speed, and not actually on speed, but in terms of how fast we go and working with our editor. But we would talk to people and we'd say, well, how are you going creating in isolation? And they'd be like, I can't do anything. It's, you know, it sucks. This isn't working for me. And so what we realized is isolation isn't good for everybody. Sometimes it doesn't work for the creative process. And so I think because we were experiencing that during COVID, we were like, well, we have to make sure we reflect that in the edit as well, that sometimes being by yourself just doesn't work.
Were there any other bands in that section that you had to cut out because it was getting too long, that came to the island and it just was a fail?
I mean, we had Roger Glover and we had Tony Iommi, but it was kind of, at the time they were coming to the island, we were trying to get into the birth of the CD and start to wrap things up. So they were like great to add some more context around some of the bands that came, but we didn't end up going fully into their stories. I mean, Tony Iommi, he didn't remember much. We had his book that we read him from his autobiography about his time down there, and he was super lovely and great. But at that point in the story, we're kind of keen to get into the Stones and move on.
I mean, and it was great to have the Rolling Stones section, and you had, again, perfect, archival footage. And did that come from Air, the video in the studio, or did that come from the Stones?
Oh, don't even get us started.
Well, because, it was just so perfect. So I'm just curious where it came
from a place called Eagle Rock, Lisa, our archive producer, found. And unfortunately, I think it turns out that there's a whole lot of other stuff that we don't have, like Mick at the Volcano. And it seemed like there was either a French documentary crew making potentially a documentary, but I think now the Stones have found out about this footage that they have, that they might release a DVD themselves of their time down there. Who knows?
That's great. But it was them in the studios. So it worked.
Yeah.
It worked perfectly. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And folks, we recently published our summer issue, our Black Widow issue. And the interesting thing is, even after we publish, we then go back and add new articles into the magazine because we're digital. We could do that. So there's a lot of great content in there. And I hope you check it out. You could see our table of contents over at backstory.net for issue 43. And you could also read our free issue if you've never read us before. And it's a really good way to see who we are and what we do. And if you like what you read, you could, of course, become a subscriber, and we hope you do. And you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. And your login credentials will work on the website where you could use that code, but also you could use them on an iPad if you have one, and use that for our app as well. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners in iTunes and Spotify, and my YouTube watchers on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page watching all these Zoomcasts become subscribers for my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our conversation with Cody Greenwood and Gracie Otto about their latest film, Under the Volcano. And that brings us to my favorite section of the film as a police fan. Them recording Ghost in the Machine, seeing the home movies of kind of them out amongst the island people and appreciating that music, and how that in turn influenced them and drove them in that direction was really fascinating. Talk about the Ghost of the Machine section and how you're starting to hear about the pressure that they're under and the band is, getting edgy with each other, which we're starting to see that culminates later.
I always find the Police an interesting case study for a band because it kind of feels like they're a little bit stuck together. Andy Summers at one time was going to join the Rolling Stones, and it was kind of like these three characters, and they are three very strong personalities. I grew up with Andy Summers. Mum is a very close friend of his, and then there's Sting, and then Stuart Copeland, who was probably, I think, my favorite interview that Gracie did. He was totally nuts, but they're very strong personalities, and I think that was, the fact that they'd lasted up until even Ghost in the Machine, obviously they did Synchronicity. It's kind of amazing for how much each of them wanted to really be front and center of that band. But I feel like with Ghost in the Machine, it was one of those things where the cracks were definitely starting to show, but it was a really commercially successful album. So I don't doubt that they were like, well, let's try and give this a shot one more time for Synchronicity. But as Gracie might want to talk to, she calls them the sport brats of the film because we had all the archive of the Police. Andy Summers had got all his amazing photography, Stuart Copeland's home video footage. All three of them wanted to talk. They've all got interesting stories. So it was quite hard to balance them out in the film because they're quite a force. And it's why we had them come in twice.
Yeah, they were definitely, I think, Andy and Stuart, some of the favourite interviews because, as Cody said, they were such strong personalities. And, I wasn't like a big Police fan, like as in I didn't know all the history about the Police going into the documentary, but I always found like some of the, footage we found from that documentary by Jules Holland. Some of that stuff that, not all of it's in the film, but it was interesting seeing kind of Sting, playing, going, oh, I can do a drum machine thing here and I can do this. And that for me was always like a bit of a catalyst of like where the music industry ended up when, now in the digital space and everything with Pro Tools coming in, that artists could go, oh, I could do this and I could also do this and tweak that. And I guess that's, part of this musical genius of Sting and him going out on his own. But I did think, oh, wow, they're all so interesting and so strong and, they were just great.
I mean, it's a different turn for the documentary because you're intimately getting with these three iconic characters talking slowly about their breakup and how it associates to the island. And that's not something that those folks do that often. That's what's
they were fun because I felt like, I don't know, I like interviewing people. And I mean, Andy and I got off to a bit of not a bad start, but sometimes I just want people to relax before the interview. And I could tell he was a bit like, oh, why am I doing this? And at this first question, I said, can you tell me your name, like who you are and what's your band? And he's like, fucking Andy Summers, I'm from the Police. And I was like, great, this guy, I've got him so offside now that he's going to really get his head fucked when he realizes how much I actually have to ask him in the next hour and know about him. That by the end, I think he came in and
he loved it. He did such a great time.
Yeah. And Stuart was great because we kind of, went to his place and the lady who worked with him was like, oh, you can be quiet setting up because Stuart's recording a theatre piece or something he was doing, composing at the time, and it was very quiet. And then he just sat on his chair and started the interview and was like, blah, like a million miles an hour at like 8 o'clock in the morning. And I had to apologise because I actually said to him, it was on stage, I said, just like you got ADHD. And then he was like, yeah, no, I know I do. And then at the end, I was like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that in a, offensive way or anything. He was like, no, it was correct. So I enjoyed his energy in the interview a lot.
I mean, they were great interviews and look, I'm a kid from Kansas. I really was into the Police. I wanted to see them when they came through on the Synchronicity tour. My parents wouldn't let me go. There was like a conflict. It was like Thanksgiving or something really dumb. Like, why would somebody have a concert near Thanksgiving? And they're like, look, they're the biggest band in the world. We will get you tickets next time they come back. And then they broke up. And so I was devastated as a teen. And then years later, I won a contest and got to see them when they did their reunion tour in like 04 or 05 or whatever and had great seats. But Synchronicity is totally a different album from their previous stuff. And what was so impressive about the interviews that you did and the way that it fits into Air Studios is, you have that great MTV shot of, throwing water in the face and them getting into a fight on the air to show how toxic it was. But they were on the island and they were stuck there. And your previous interview says that, all three of their wives wanted a divorce after the previous album. And so they were in this point of transition. And for all the footage that you show beforehand of everybody collaborating, you show the separate recording was the only way that they could get through it, by separating into different spaces so that they weren't with each other because they were getting along so poorly, and how that isolation plus the isolation of the island was affecting them, but also affecting the music, which sounds completely different from just about anything that they had done before that. So that was, hands down, one of my favorite parts of the documentary. I'm curious what your approach was when you were editing it, because thematically the isolation of the island and the isolation from each other really worked well.
Well, they were perfectly timed in the film as well, that it was like, about halfway through that there's the rise of the place, and then it's like, well, not everything can be so happy all the time. And I think obviously there was the way people were recording albums started to be different, and they liked, to record in isolation to get exactly just the drums, as Stuart says, and everything. But yeah, even when you see those photos, like Stuart just looks so unhappy upstairs by himself with that drum kit. Like, now he'd just be in another country on a Zoom link doing the drums or whatever. So
Right.
Started to take away from that whole collaboration and being together in the room. And that's obviously the energy that when the three of them were in the room together, it just, imploded in a good way. Yeah.
It was a great part of the movie. We're going to say something, Cody?
I was just going to say that there's a shot within that section of the film, or sort of around that. It's a drone shot of the volcano coming in, and for us, the volcano we really want it to be a metaphor in the film for sort of like, things starting to go wrong, and a metaphor for, when that volcano erupts, it was essentially the end of analog recording. Things are moving to digital, and we bring in the volcano at that point in the film, I think, to kind of start to foreshadow that things are really changing in the recording industry. And as Gracie said, I think the Police are a perfect example of that, because the digital and the recording techniques are definitely starting to seep in when you're starting to record in different rooms and you have that ability.
I mean, it worked beautifully, and it led right into your Dire Straits section about when Air Studios became the first digital recording for that album, which was intended to be the first big CD from Philips Electronics, which I was aware of kind of, but not as much that it was recorded that way, because everybody started going through their back libraries and adapting to CD. But yeah, Brothers in Arms was recorded specifically for CD and just became such a hit from that. So I mean, that was a really great section as well. Logistically, when the hurricane hit and then the volcano, how much was lost at Air? Because you showed that after the hurricane, which was really the first impact that affected them, that they had to abandon the studio. Were there tapes and things from the archive that were lost, that were never recovered because you talk about mold? Or did overall, pretty much at that point, everything get brought back to London when they realized that they were going to be slowing down before the volcano even erupted?
I think that Sir George Martin, he was a visionary. He knew that by the time that hurricane hit, that the industry was changing. So the hurricane didn't physically destroy the studio; it physically destroyed the island. The island was totally decimated. But the way that studio was built, because I guess it had to be soundproofed and all the latest technology, it actually sustained the hurricane. I think they turned it into Government House for a little while they were rebuilding. But George Martin, it was more about the fact that I think, at the end of the 80s and, after the Rolling Stones, he very much realized that, record budgets were not going to be the same. They're not going to send these guys down to the Caribbean anymore. So nothing was lost. I think there was a transition period of what are we going to do with this place post hurricane, and then I think the volcano cemented that for him, that it was the end.
Editing is the final stage of writing for a documentary. You just said that you were editing during the pandemic. Talk us through your editing process, how you adapted to the pandemic, and then how long it took to edit this and find the right cut.
Well, we brought on Karen Johnson, who edited my first documentary, because I think, what I was saying to Cody when I first came on, my film was very collaborative and I really liked the team I worked with. And Karen is so good at kind of crafting that backbone and going, but what are we trying to say? But yes, who cares about that? What are we actually trying to say with the film? And so we did, like, I guess, she was editing a lot as we were still filming, which was a bit of like catch up, because we'd still be kind of going out and not even seeing the rushes, but then she was kind of catching up to everything we knew because we'd sat through all the interviews. And then after we kind of did the assembly, we went back and kind of reworked the script and tried to work out, that we needed more context around where the bands were at that period in their life. or like, you know, with George's history and stuff, for like people who were super fans who knew everything and went, yeah, I know who Elton exactly was at that time, but for people our generation that might not have. And so it was kind of working out these miniature kind of structures in the film that we went back into the edit. But then the whole edit, what did you say yesterday? It was 24 weeks?
30.
Oh, 30 weeks. And then the last stage, I guess, yeah, I was in Sydney, Cody was in WA. And I mean, I think, you know, post at a certain point, if you guys are all on the same page, I'm in post on a film at the moment with the editor, and it's very easy because, you know, we talk on the phone or whatever, and you don't need to be in the room. It was great that we got to all be in the room together in 2019, and that whole energy in the edit.
Tell us what you were doing to share footage, because in my magazine, in Backstory Magazine, we interviewed the editors of Suicide Squad, and they were talking about how difficult it was until Warner Brothers set up proper servers, because there were two of them sharing and their editorial assistants. So it was a much bigger film. But how are you guys sharing footage back and forth?
I mean, you can go on a Zoom, and like I do with my editor now, and she brings her Avid up on the video and watch stuff.
Did you have a central server so that you
yeah. Well, we just use Zoom. I think obviously things like those films are big and they have privacy. I mean, we had privacy issues as well, but like,
sorry to ask, Gracie, but are you saying you used Zoom screen share of your editor's desktop and that was good enough to see, or did you have like a Dropbox?
That's what I've been using now with my feature film. But Karen, I mean, a few times I think we logged into Zoom and did stuff, but we also had every interview transcribed on our iPads where we, you know, highlighted a whole bunch of stuff. Cody and I knew the material so well. So if we got on a phone call to talk about something, it was like, yeah, you can kind of, you don't need to, you know, see it. We were sitting there during the interviews and knew the material a lot. So I think it's different for everyone, but I think we were lucky that we were at a point where we just interviewed Elton's band and Jerry Beckley. So we kind of were like just hoping to get Elton John or Keith Richards at that stage. And then the pandemic hit. So we were really in that like last final throes that, the remote process was fine. I don't know how it would have been if it was at the start of the process for us.
I mean, that's a big cut, 30 weeks. You know, that's a long time, but it makes sense because you had so much footage. In the modern atmosphere, did you ever consider making this into a limited TV series rather than a film? Because I'm sure your original cuts probably could have been like a 3-part series or something like that.
Yeah, I think there was discussions about that from the very early stages of making this film. Well, why not make it into a series and each episode is like the police, Elton, blah, blah, blah. I think why we were resistant to that is, you know, as I was saying, we're interested in the human story of these guys. And I think if we had done just a police documentary, we would have broken it down and got into the technical side of the chord progression of every breath you take and all that kind of stuff. And Gracie and I as filmmakers, that wasn't what we were gravitating to. So there's a version, I think, if it had have been maybe a director that was a mega fan of these artists, that they would have turned it into a TV series. But all we cared about was, you know, the relationships and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure that question will continue to come up.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Why don't you turn it into
you could do one on the Neve, you know, just there's so much.
Well, I mean, you also have Air London, so I mean, you could do a series that continues without a doubt. You know, it's always fun to hear about scenes that were cut or deleted that, you know, filmmakers hated to cut but had to make the tough decision for the benefit of the flow of the movie and everything else. What were some scenes like that you guys held on to right till the end, but you knew for the betterment of the movie itself, they needed to get chopped?
I don't think there was...
well, I mean, we had a really fun time interviewing Jimmy Buffett. It was a disaster of an interview. We actually, we were in San Francisco interviewing Roger Glover, and all the airports closed down and we had to drive through the night. We got to Malibu at like 7 a.m. Our interview with Jimmy was at 8 a.m. We hadn't slept a wink. And he was like, I'm just gonna go out surfing for a couple hours. Is that right with you guys? But he told us so many great stories. And there was one in particular where he talks about the studio manager who he has frustrations with in the film about the bar. But essentially the studio manager, they were down at the beach one day and he was watching the guys trying to pull the motor on a little like dinghy boat. I don't know what you call them. We call them dinghies in Australia, a little rowboat thing. And the engine wouldn't start and he started drifting out to sea. And because Jimmy didn't really like this guy very much, he was like, oh, whatever, there goes the studio manager with his wife. And they went back up to the studio and they're having a great time. And then a few hours later, George Martin rocks in and he said, you know, where's Denny? Where's the studio manager? And they're like, oh, we saw him actually drifting around the corner, and the currents around Montserrat are really strong. And so George Martin like sounded the alarms and to find this guy. And meanwhile, Jimmy Buffett threw a Lost at Sea party at the studio. So he invited the whole island, and they had this massive Lost at Sea party, and they actually ended up having to call the Coast Guard, and they didn't find Denny and his wife until the next day.
Wow.
Floating around the corner. So there was like all sorts of wild stories like this that went on that didn't make it. I mean, Gracie, can you think of any others that we excluded from the film?
Not really. Like, I feel like that, yeah, Jimmy was a great interview, but yeah, there was stuff, you know, yeah, more gossipy things or something that like weren't really going to make it into the film. But yeah, some of the Danny, like the local windsurfer, he told, you know, wild stories that went so
Crazy
left
stories.
tangent. Like, I was looking around the room and everyone kind of go, I don't know how I'm going to get this interview back.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. It's a 90-minute film, which is a very tight runtime. It could have been longer. What was your longest cut?
I think we were pretty good. We were pretty good on time. Do you think, I mean, I think it only probably would have maxed. Oh no, we watched a 3-hour assembly at one stage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very common.
That was the longest. Yeah, but we were pretty good. We were very wary of like audience's attention span, the fact that, you know, some of these bands might not have been for everyone. Like, not everybody's a Duran Duran fan, or you know, I think everybody's a Stones fan, but
even people in our team, they'd be like, oh, why that band? Or, you know, and yeah, so it was that hard thing of going, yeah, people like, I love the Police, but I hate Duran Duran, or vice versa. So,
you know, we're starting to run out of time, and I guess one question to end on before we find out what you're off to next is your toughest scenes. So Cody, we'll start with you. Your toughest scene as a producer and also thinking as a writer, and then Gracie, your toughest scene as a director and as a writer. And they don't have to be the same scene. They could be different from producing to writing, etc. Starting with you, Cody.
I think Gracie's probably going to agree with me on this. This isn't a scene; it's more of a segment. But the end is so tough. We always had this this. Yeah, maybe not different scene. Yeah. We always knew, perfect, we've got this end of a volcano, and you know, you got the start of George Martin and the Beatles, but that hurricane and volcano, to get that right and have that not feel like a double ending. And I do think that people in that part of the film still have to kind of get over the hurricane to get to the volcano, was really tricky. We tried it so many ways. We tried taking out the hurricane, but you know, that's not the truth of the matter. So it always felt like we had a bit of a double ending. And that took weeks for us to get into a place where we could sort of move through that in a way that wasn't confusing for the audience or didn't give them an emotional, you know. And I also think for me,
I mean, it worked really well. It seemed like a 1-2 blow, you know, like just as they're recovering from the hurricane, all hopes are dashed by the time the volcano hits. There just can't be a future for it.
Yeah, and go trust the editing process. It's like, you know, like for me, it was actually the beginning, because it was like, how do we, and I think it was you, Cody, that in the end just was like, just put hot at the start. And because we had versions where it was like, let's go, you know, we'll go straight to the island because the film's about the studio, we want to get there. But then it was like, okay, well, now we're going to go back to London, do just like a brief 20-minute history on Sir George Martin. And so it was that thing of trying to, get the film going, because all of a sudden it was like, you know, at certain stages, like half an hour or 40 minutes, it's like Jimmy Buffett arrives. And we're like, we need Jimmy Buffett to arrive at this time. But yeah, it was that thing of trying to go, we need people to understand George's legacy who don't know about him or don't know the history or like why this is important for him. And then, you know, the whole history of like building the place before somebody came down there, but then kind of going, well, the film's about the bands that were down there. So I think that was a thing for me that went back and forth, because as soon as you went back to London, you were in this very British film, you know, very like history. And then, you know, you had the other side of the island, and trying to work out how to do that, I think, was the hardest part for me.
Okay, that makes sense. And that's thematically, logistically, Cody, what was your most difficult day as a producer or task that you had? Wait, and I'm gonna take out music rights, because I know that was, you know, a Herculean effort, but logistically, as a filmmaker, as a producer on a documentary, what was something that still kind of gives you a nightmare flash when you think back on it?
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah. So the thing about making documentaries and making archival documentaries is, even if the people aren't in the film, so Elton John, the Rolling Stones, they still have to sign off on their likeness in the story. So, you know, Paul McCartney, Rolling Stones, Elton, they all had to watch the film and say, yeah, we approve. But there's an added layer of complication, because what happens is, as a producer, you go, okay, here's the film, Elton, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Paul McCartney, please watch and approve. And then you'd have a cut and it has archive in it and music, and they'd come back with comments of take this out. And that has this on-flow effect of, okay, well, if you take out that archive, you know, there goes a chunk that I've already approved with this person. And if we, you know, they want the music to go longer. And so there was it was a web. And I'm quite a control freak as a producer. And Under the Volcano was one of those films where, because there were so many approvals over likeness, music, and archive, I would have to step back sometimes and just let it go haywire and then try and rein it back in, because everything had an on-flow effect. And, you know, even to the point of our sound guy, Lawrence Horn, our sound designer, who was amazing. He was in Buenos Aires, and him and I would be on the phone every day, and I'd be like, make sure you don't go 2 seconds over in that Police song, because then it's going to cost an extra, you know, $8,000. And it was just, yeah, it was a web. I've got this, a spreadsheet. I love spreadsheets. And I've got this spreadsheet, which is all the approvals on the film. And every day I would turn something green, like Elton's approved his likeness, you know, Elton's team.
It's also hard because at that point you want to also send the film at its best quality, but you don't want to start the sound mix or the grade until it's approved.
Yeah,
which makes it hard for somebody to evaluate, because they could be watching at a lower quality, a lower resolution, which turns them off.
Yeah, and then you have to buy the archive for it to be in high resolution. It was insane. 22.
Chicken before the egg.
Gracie, what was one of your most difficult logistic moments on set as a director? You know, not on set, but I mean in the field. Something just, it wasn't going your way, but you're a filmmaker. You are on a limited amount of time.
It was like on the set, but we got really close to getting Elton John, and one of my friends was like, if you come to the Chanel dinner in London, I'll sit you next to David Furnish. And so I was texting Cody, and I got all dressed up, and a lot of people from my first film were there. So I was kind of like not feeling like the only non-celebrity in the room. And then when I went to sit down, my name tag wasn't there, but I was sitting between the director of Rocket Man and David Furnish. So he put me in between them in this like shared seat. And I thought, well, I'll probably get 2 minutes to randomly pitch the fact that we need Elton for the film, because we'd emailed him. And then David Furnish and I just got on like a house on fire, and it got so deep that I didn't know how to turn around and say, he's like, what are you working on? And I was like, oh, I'm doing a documentary about my dad. So I kind of told him some of that stuff. He's like, that's amazing. And then, just at the end, I was like, I'm also doing this like little film with Universal about, Air Studios Montserrat. And he's like, oh, Elton went down there. And I was like, yeah, actually, Elton went down 3 times. It was like the biggest recording artist to go down there. And he was like, oh, I think something came past my desk. And I was like, that, actually, you know what? That was me, but I think you guys were on tour, and like, so we had this whole kind of like, and he was like, we should hang out when I'm in Sydney in a few weeks. And I was like, we should, as we've been like walking past his house every day trying to stalk him. So we got so close to getting him, and we had the meeting set up with David, and then COVID hit and they just left.
Yeah. That makes
And then it was, like, maybe I'll come, if you guys are in London in April, it was like, I guess maybe the world will be shut down for 3 weeks. And then we'll go over to London and do, another meeting. And so I think, so that was kind of disappointing, because I feel like Cody and I had gone to like the 60th level of a video game called Can You Get Elton John for the movie? But that was just more a bit disappointing. But at the same time, the interviews with him, it was great seeing him back at that time talking about it, and you really felt like you were back there. And sometimes, you take the risk of interviewing people, and, it's always, interesting what people, you want them to kind of look like they're back in their moment. And, I'm sure Elton would have been great. And like, I do think we would have got him had it not been for COVID. But
well, and through archival footage, you actually have a really good presence for him, so that still works. What are you both working on next, Cody? What's something that you're writing or producing next?
I've just about to release another feature documentary called Girl Like You, which is a love story documentary about a couple undergoing a gender transition that we've shot over 6 years. So that's about to be released here in Australia and some festivals overseas, which will be announced soon. And then I'm moving into the feature narrative space at the moment. So working on some really exciting films here in Western Australia, and developing a series as well for the streamers. So sort of jumping straight back into the crazy world. And Gracie and I are at the same time trying to find our next subject. So we're, we get on the phone every day and be like, who can we get? So, we keep saying that we'll never make a film about the 10 most famous bands of all time. Next time we'll just pick one band or one person and go from there.
That's great. Gracie, what are you working on?
I've got my first feature film narrative in post-production called Seriously Red, which is a film with my production company Dollhouse Pictures. And then I've directed on a comedy series called The Moth Effect, which is like a sketch comedy show that just came out worldwide on Amazon. It drops every week, so we just dropped episode 3 yesterday. And then, doing a fashion show here, do some fashion work. And then, meant to have started a show with Netflix, but with the pandemic, that could just disappear. Who knows? So just kind of, waiting to see for the next few weeks, but definitely busy. Usually I like to work on like 4 things at once, but I'm working on 3, so it's okay.
I think three's a good way to still split your focus. But look,
I'm doing a documentary on my dad as well.
Well, yes, that's the big one. And so I'm excited to see that when you're done with it. But look, you both, I thank you for being so generous with your time. I really love this movie. You painted such an intimate portrait of artists making art and not really always knowing where they were going, but having the comfort in Air Studios to be able to fail when they needed to and to find a way through it. And that really resonated. So congrats on a great movie. And Cody, Gracie, I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to Cody Greenwood and Gracie Otto for being so generous with their time and coming down to chat about their latest film, Under the Volcano. And remember, folks, let your friends and family know about Under the Volcano. This is an independent film, so it's great to get the word out there, and it's such a fun film to watch. So, Bill, thank you for telling them about it. And folks, this was originally done as a virtual screening. We have an invite list. It's free to sign up for. You could find it at backstory.net/events. And you could sign up to be on our newsletter, and you'll get invites when we do virtual screenings. So you could watch the film and see the Q&A before anyone else. And you'll also get updates about what we're doing with the magazine and the podcast and cool things for you to read and listen to. So I hope you'll join our mailing list, and then you could join us hopefully for our next virtual Q&A screening. And of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You can read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And look, if you want to become a subscriber, your support is more important now than ever. You could use code word SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine that you could use either on our website on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. So you could read the free issue over there if you've never read us before to help in your decision. But thanks for considering, because I would love to have you all as a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2021. All rights reserved. And if you ever want to reach out to me, you can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter as @YoGoldsmith. And I also run the Backstory_mag web account on Twitter as well. And it's those same 2 accounts on Instagram, Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or Backstory_mag. I have a Facebook fan page. I'm on there sometimes, but not as often as the other 2 places. And of course, if you want to email, you could always write into backstoryletters@gmail.com. I promise not to respond immediately, but I will respond soon. It just takes a little time to get through the email sometimes. But look, I'd love to hear from you, so feel free to drop me a line anytime. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.